What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy finally snaps on live television? In just 21 seconds, everything exploded, and what Joy Behar said next left Harrison Ford absolutely furious, storming off the set in the most dramatic exit The View has ever witnessed. Before we get into this unbelievable showdown, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, the confrontations they don't want you to see, and the moments that celebrities try to bury. Hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Last night's episode of The View was supposed to be a simple conversation about Harrison Ford's latest project, but nobody could have predicted the absolute chaos that was about to unfold. From the moment Ford walked onto that stage, you could feel something was different. The tension in the air was thick, and Joy Behar had that look in her eyes, the one she gets when she's ready to dig deep and ask the questions that make guests uncomfortable. Ford sat down, gave his usual gruff hello to the audience, and settled into his chair. The other hosts, Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, and the rest of the panel, all smiled and welcomed him warmly. But Joy, she had something else on her mind. She started off friendly enough, asking about his new film, talking about his incredible career spanning decades, from Indiana Jones to Han Solo. Ford answered in his typical short, no-nonsense way. He's never been one for long, flowery answers, and everyone knows that about him. But then Joy shifted gears. She leaned forward, and you could see her eyes narrow just a bit. She brought up something that happened years ago, a comment Ford had made in an old interview about Hollywood politics and how he tries to stay out of all that mess. Joy wasn't having it, though. She looked right at him and said something like, "You say you stay out of politics, Harrison, but isn't that just a privilege? Isn't that just you, being able to ignore what's happening because it doesn't affect you?" The studio went quiet. You could hear a pin drop. Ford's jaw tightened, and he stared at Joy for a long moment. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that this was about to go somewhere nobody expected. Ford finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "I don't think you understand what I meant by that, Joy. I've lived my life a certain way, worked hard, and I don't feel the need to broadcast every opinion I have to the world." Joy wasn't backing down, though. She came back at him harder. "But Harrison, when you have the platform you have, when you have the influence you have, don't you think it's irresponsible not to use it? There are people out there suffering, and you're just making movies and staying quiet." Ford's face changed right there. You could see the anger building behind his eyes. He sat up straighter, his whole body language shifting from relaxed to ready for a fight. "Irresponsible?" he said, his voice getting louder. "You're calling me irresponsible? I've worked in this industry for 50 damn years, and I've seen people like you try to tell everyone how they should think, how they should act, what they should say. I'm not your puppet, Joy." The audience gasped. Whoopi tried to jump in, saying something like, "Okay, let's all take a breath here." But Joy waved her off. She was locked in now, committed to this confrontation. "I'm not trying to make you a puppet, Harrison. I'm trying to get you to see that silence is complicity. When you stay quiet about important issues, you're part of the problem." Ford laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was cold and sharp. "Silence is complicity? That's rich, coming from someone who talks for a living. Maybe you talk so much because you don't actually do anything. Did you ever think about that?" The words hung in the air like a bomb that just went off. The other hosts looked absolutely shocked. Sarah Haynes had her hand over her mouth. Whoopi was trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster of an interview. Joy's face turned red. You could see she was getting really upset now, her voice rising to match Ford's intensity. "How dare you? I've spent my entire career fighting for what's right, speaking up for people who don't have a voice. And you sit there in your ivory tower making millions of dollars playing pretend, and you have the nerve to tell me I don't do anything?" Ford stood up, just stood right up from his chair like he was done with the whole thing. "You know what your problem is, Joy? You think talking about problems is the same as solving them. You think because you sit here every day and complain about everything, that makes you some kind of hero. Well, it doesn't. It just makes you loud. The studio audience was going absolutely crazy at this point. Some people were cheering, some were booing. Nobody could believe what they were watching. This was Harrison Ford, the guy who never loses his cool, the guy who barely ever does talk shows at all. And here he was, tearing into Joy Behar on live television. Joy shot up from her seat too, pointing her finger at Ford. You think you're better than everyone else, don't you? You think because you're some big movie star that you can just walk in here and insult me on my own show? This is my show, Harrison. Your show? Ford shot back, his voice now at full volume. This stopped being your show the second you decided to attack me for living my life the way I choose to live it. I came here to talk about my work, not to be lectured by you about how I should think or what I should say. I'm not one of your yes men, Joy. I never have been, and I never will be. Whoopi was standing now too, trying desperately to get control of the situation. Okay, everybody, let's just calm down. We can have a civil conversation about this. But neither Joy nor Harrison was listening. They were in their own world now, locked in this battle of wills that neither one was willing to lose. Joy took a step closer to where Ford was standing. You want to talk about living your life the way you choose? Fine. But don't come on this show and act like you're above it all, like you're too good to care about the world around you. That's not admirable, Harrison. That's cowardly. That word, cowardly, that was the final straw. Ford's face went from angry to absolutely furious in an instant. Cowardly? He repeated, his voice shaking with rage. You're calling me a coward? Lady, I've faced down more challenges in my career, in my life, than you could ever imagine. I've broken bones doing my own stunts. I've worked through injuries. I've dealt with more crap from people like you than I care to remember. And you have the balls to call me a coward because I won't dance to your tune? Joy wasn't backing down, though. She stood her ground, matching his intensity. Yes, I'm calling you a coward. When people with your power and influence refuse to speak up about injustice, about inequality, about all the things wrong with this world, that is cowardice. You hide behind your tough guy image, but when it comes down to it, you're just scared to take a real stand. The other hosts were trying everything to break this up, but it was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Nobody could stop it. Ford grabbed his microphone off his lapel and threw it down on the table. The sound it made echoed through the entire studio. You know what, Joy? I'm done here. I came here as a courtesy, to talk about my film, to connect with fans, and instead I get ambushed by you and your self-righteous bullshit. I don't need this. I don't need you. And I sure as hell don't need to sit here and be insulted by someone who thinks yelling on television makes them important. Joy's voice was shaking now, a mix of anger and something else, maybe hurt pride. Oh, so now I'm self-righteous? At least I stand for something, Harrison. At least I'm not afraid to use my voice. You can storm off this set. You can throw your little tantrum. But everyone watching knows the truth. You're just another privileged celebrity who doesn't give a damn about anyone but himself. Ford grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. His face was still red with anger, his hand shaking slightly as he put it on. Privileged? You want to talk about privilege? You sit here every single day in your comfortable studio, making your comfortable salary, judging everyone else from your comfortable chair. Don't you dare lecture me about privilege. At least I earned everything I have through hard work, not by sitting around gossiping and tearing people down. Hard work? Joy practically screamed the words. You think acting is hard work? Try fighting for women's rights. Try fighting for equality. Try using your brain for something other than memorizing lines written by someone else. That was it. That was the moment where everything reached the point of no return. Ford looked at Joy with pure contempt in his eyes. Wow, he said, his voice now eerily calm. Acting isn't hard work. That's what you think. You know what, Joy? This conversation perfectly sums up why I avoid shows like this. People like you don't want a conversation. You want to grandstand. You want to feel superior. You want to tear people down so you can feel better about yourself. He started walking toward the exit, but Joy wasn't done. She followed him a few steps, still yelling. That's right! Run away! That's what you do, isn't it? When things get tough, when someone challenges you, you just run. Some tough guy you are. Ford stopped dead in his tracks. He turned around slowly, and for a second, it looked like he might walk back over there. The security guards near the stage even took a step forward, just in case. But Ford didn't move closer. Instead, he just looked at Joy with disgust and said, "You're not worth it. You're not worth another second of my time. Good luck with your show, Joy. I hope making people feel small makes you feel big." Joy was still fuming, her chest heaving with anger. "Get out then! Get the hell out of my studio! You think you're so much better than everyone else? So go, leave. Nobody here needs your arrogance or your attitude." The other hosts were trying to pull Joy back, trying to get her to stop, but she was too fired up. She kept shouting as Ford walked away. "You hear me, Harrison? You're not welcome here anymore. You can take your movies and your ego and get the hell out." Ford didn't turn around again. He just kept walking, his back straight, his stride purposeful. You could see the anger in every step he took. As he reached the door that led backstage, he paused for just a moment. Without turning around, he raised his hand and gave a dismissive wave, like he was swatting away an annoying fly. Then he pushed through the door and was gone. The studio was in absolute chaos. The audience was on their feet, some cheering, some booing, everyone talking at once. Joy stood there breathing hard, her hands on her hips, still staring at the door Ford had just walked through. Whoopi was trying to calm her down, saying something in her ear, but Joy just shook her head. Sarah Haynes looked like she might cry. The whole panel seemed shell-shocked by what had just happened. Backstage, crew members scrambled to figure out what to do next. This was live television, and they had just witnessed one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. Harrison Ford, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, had just been kicked off The View after a screaming match with Joy Behar that neither of them held back on. The door swung shut behind Ford, and in that moment, everyone knew this was going to be the clip that played over and over again. This was the moment that would define this episode, this week, maybe even this entire season of The View. Harrison Ford had finally snapped, and Joy Behar had pushed him to a breaking point that nobody thought existed. As the cameras kept rolling, Joy finally sat back down, still visibly shaking with anger. She looked directly into the camera and said, "Well, that was Harrison Ford, everyone. A man who clearly can't handle being challenged on his own privilege and his own silence." Whoopi tried to change the subject, to move on to commercial, but the damage was done. The confrontation was over, but the shockwaves were just beginning. Ford's car was already pulling away from the studio, his security team rushing him out of the building before any more drama could unfold. Inside that vehicle, Ford sat in silence, his jaw still clenched, his mind probably racing with everything that had just happened. He had walked onto that stage as a guest promoting his latest film, and he was leaving as the man who got into the biggest fight in The View's history. Back in the studio, as they finally cut to commercial, Joy sat there surrounded by her co-hosts. Some were trying to comfort her, some were probably questioning what the hell had just happened. The audience slowly quieted down, but you could still feel the electricity in the air. This wasn't just another interview gone wrong. This was a full-scale war of words between two strong personalities who refused to back down. The makeup team rushed over to fix Joy's appearance before they came back from commercial, but no amount of powder could hide the fact that she was still furious. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she took a sip of water, trying to compose herself. The other hosts exchanged worried glances, knowing that the rest of this show was going to be incredibly awkward. When they came back from commercial, the energy was completely different. The usual banter and jokes were gone, replaced by a tension that hung over everything. They tried to move on to other topics, other guests, but everyone watching knew that nothing else mattered. The only thing anyone would remember from this episode was Harrison Ford and Joy Behar's explosive confrontation. Social media had already exploded within minutes. Clips of the argument were being shared thousands of times per second. People were taking sides, some defending Ford's right to privacy and his frustration with being lectured, others supporting Joy's stance that celebrities have a responsibility to speak up. The debate raged online just as intensely as it had raged on that stage. Ford's phone was probably blowing up with calls from his publicist, his manager, his friends in the industry. Everyone would want to know what happened, why it escalated so quickly, what was said off camera. But knowing Harrison Ford, he probably turned his phone off and just sat in silence, processing the whole thing in his own way. Back at the View studio, as the show finally wrapped up for the day, the crew started breaking down the set. Everyone was talking about what they had just witnessed. Crew members who had worked on the show for years said they had never seen anything like it. The guests who had been scheduled to appear after Ford had watched the whole thing unfold from the green room, probably grateful they didn't have to follow that disaster. Joy gathered her things, still clearly upset about the confrontation. Her co-hosts tried to talk to her, to debrief about what had happened, but she seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts. Whether she regretted pushing Ford so hard or stood by every word she said, only she knew. But one thing was certain: this was a confrontation that would follow both of them for a long time. The security footage from backstage would later show Ford walking through the corridors with purpose, not stopping to talk to anyone, not acknowledging the stunned looks from crew members who stepped aside to let him pass. He moved like a man on a mission, and that mission was to get as far away from that studio as possible. His security team had to almost jog to keep up with his furious pace. As Ford's car pulled out onto the New York City streets, he probably looked out the window at the city passing by, thinking about how a simple talk show appearance had turned into a complete disaster. He had been in this business long enough to know that this clip would follow him everywhere now. Every interview, every public appearance, someone would ask him about it. The moment would be dissected, analyzed, and replayed endlessly. But in true Harrison Ford fashion, he probably didn't care. He had said what he wanted to say, stood up for himself the way he always had, and walked away with his head held high. That's who he was. Someone who didn't compromise his values or his boundaries for anyone, not even for a popular daytime talk show host. The View's producers were probably having an emergency meeting right about then, figuring out how to handle the fallout. Would they issue a statement? Would they apologize? Would they double down and support Joy's confrontation? The decisions they made in the next few hours would shape how this story was remembered. Meanwhile, Ford was probably already thinking about his next move, his next project, putting this whole mess behind him. He had been through controversies before, had dealt with media firestorms, and had always come out the other side. This would be no different, even if it was one of the most dramatic exits in talk show history. The other guests who appeared on The View that day probably felt awkward, knowing their segments would be overshadowed by the Ford Behar blowout. No matter what they talked about, no matter how interesting their stories were, everyone would only remember one thing from this episode. As evening fell on New York City, the entertainment news shows were all leading with the same story: Harrison Ford's explosive confrontation with Joy Behar on The View. The clips played over and over, with commentary from various hosts and guests, everyone giving their opinion on who was right and who was wrong. Ford was probably at home by then, maybe having a drink, maybe calling his close friends to vent about what had happened. People who knew him well probably weren't surprised that he finally snapped. He had always been someone who valued his privacy, who bristled at being told what to do or think, and Joy had pushed every single one of those buttons. Joy was probably doing her own processing, maybe talking to her family, maybe defending herself to friends who called to check on her. She had never been one to back down from a fight, and this was the biggest one she'd had in years. Whether she regretted the confrontation or felt justified in pushing forward, she would have to live with the consequences of this moment. The studio audience members who had witnessed the whole thing firsthand were probably calling their friends and family, telling them about the crazy experience they just had. They came expecting a normal episode of The View and got front row seats to one of the most dramatic confrontations in daytime television history. As the night went on, more and more people weighed in on the controversy. Celebrities tweeted their thoughts, talk show hosts discussed it on their programs, and regular people argued about it at dinner tables across the country. The confrontation had struck a nerve, touching on larger issues about celebrity responsibility, political discourse, and how we talk to each other when we disagree. But at the center of it all were two people, Harrison Ford and Joy Behar, who had let their emotions get the better of them and created a moment that would be talked about for years to come. A moment where words turned into weapons, where frustration boiled over into fury, and where a simple interview became an unforgettable battle that ended with Ford walking out that door and never looking back.